If you're like most people raised on pop culture and high school myths, you probably imagine a dimly lit Roman chamber with reclining aristocrats, pausing their feast to lean into a marble basin and purge their delicacies, only to return for another round of honey-glazed dormice and jellied peacock tongues. The truth? A lot more boring, and far more revealing of how historical myths distort our sense of the past. Let's start at the root. The term vomitorium first appears in Roman architectural texts, specifically in works describing amphitheaters and stadiums. It refers not to a place for purging, but rather an ingress and egress structure, a covered corridor or exit tunnel through which large crowds could spew forth. The Latin verb vomere does mean to spew forth, but not with a gastrointestinal connotation. Roman engineers, being wonderfully practical people, designed these passageways to allow up to 50,000 people to leave the Colosseum in under 15 minutes. That's where the real marvel lies. Not in a grotesque eating ritual, but in civic design that wouldn't be matched until modern stadiums. So, how did this term get twisted into something so dramatically different? The misinterpretation of the term began in the Renaissance, but the myth took firm root in the 19th century. Romantic historians and early anthropologists, fascinated with decadence and decay, began to take liberties. The idea of gluttonous Romans using special rooms to purge mid-feast was delightfully grotesque, a perfect moral tale of excess for the prudish Victorian reader. Writers, including French and British scholars, began using vomitorium as a symbol of Roman debauchery. The more salacious the description, the more popular it became in lectures and early school textbooks. The academic irony? The Romans themselves would have been baffled by this interpretation. No Latin source ever uses a word in the context of food. Even worse, the true story is more mundane. If Romans did vomit during meals, they likely did it in chamber pots or simply stepped aside. There was no architectural feature designed for it, just the realities of an overfed elite with access to emetics, those bitter herbal concoctions that made the body reject its contents. But don't misunderstand, Romans were gluttonous in their own way. Wealthy Romans hosted banquets known as convivia, where food was served in multiple courses, often stretching from early evening into the late hours of the night. The goal wasn't just sustenance, it was performance. To dine in the triclinium, the three-couch dining room, was to signal status, wealth, and control over labor and luxury. The more exotic the ingredient, the more power it projected. Flamingo tongue, a delicacy. Boiled ostrich, a novelty. Live fish that squirmed when sprinkled with garum, theater. And the vomiting? It was certainly practiced by some, but more in the vein of bulimic indulgence than institutional ritual. The philosopher Seneca mentions guests who emptied their stomachs mid-meal, but not as a rule, rather, as a symptom of excess, so pronounced it bordered on madness. These behaviors were exceptions, not the norm. But to later historians, the idea of the Roman world vomiting its way toward collapse was just too satisfying to ignore. The real vomitoria, those passageways designed to regulate foot traffic, tell a different story. Rather than decadence, they illustrate discipline, planning, and public order. Roman amphitheaters weren't just brutal. They were finely tuned machines of mass entertainment. Each vomitorium was precisely aligned, symmetrical, and connected to specific seating tiers. Senators, plebs, and slaves entered through different zones. Ushers regulated flow. And if you've ever attended a modern sports event, you've experienced a design that directly descends from the Roman model. Ironically, the term used to celebrate civic efficiency is now remembered as a punchline about binge-eating emperors. There's also a biological element worth exploring. Roman medicine, particularly the humoral system inherited from Greek theories, often promoted vomiting as a form of bodily balance. One might be instructed to induce vomiting during certain illnesses, or to make room for additional food when recovering strength. This led to some elites purposefully vomiting at feasts, not for pleasure, but as part of a health regimen. The boundary between nourishment and medicine was blurred. And in a world where food preservation was uncertain and parasites were common, the urge to vomit might have been more reflex than ritual. So why does the myth persist? Partly because it fits our modern narrative needs. The vomitoria myth allows us to look back on Rome not as a society of engineers and bureaucrats, but as a cautionary tale of moral failure. It's more comfortable to imagine our decline as stemming from decadence than from something banal like climate instability, economic strain, or poor administrative reform. But the real story? Far more boring and far more instructive. The vomitorium myth, in its misinterpretation, has ironically become one of the most revealing examples of how we misunderstand ancient societies. Not because we don't know the facts, but because we often prefer the fiction. What happens when the symbols we inherit from history tell us more about our own desires than the truth of the past? In the previous section, we explored how the term vomitorium evolved from architectural terminology to mythological indulgence. Now, we turn to what actually happened inside those Roman banquets, the daily rituals, dietary habits, survival tactics, and the quietly grotesque reality of Roman luxury. Spoiler, they didn't need a vomitorium. At the heart of any elite Roman feast was a triclinium, a formal dining room named after the three couches clini, arranged around a central table. Guests reclined on their left elbows, allowing their right hands to pick at platters offered by a ten of slaves. It was an arrangement designed for display, not comfort. Every action had a symbolic undertone. Where you sat mattered. Guests of honor lay closest to the host. Lesser dignitaries were rotated and over the course of the meal, like intellectual stagehands brought in to recite poetry, offer philosophical tidbits, or play music between courses. In many ways, Roman dining resembled a public performance, a fusion of nourishment, political signaling, and social hierarchy. Everyone was watching. Everyone was being watched. And if you happened to vomit, you'd be disrupting the rhythm, not partaking in it. Roman banquets didn't follow our 3-meal-a-day system. For most people, especially slaves and lower classes, food came when it came, and it was simple. A standard diet consisted of pulse, a porridge made from grains and water, olives, onions, legumes, and stale bread, cheap wine watered down, occasional fish or eggs. But in the homes of the elite, meals became elaborate multi-course affairs. A typical cena dinner might include gustaccio, appetizers, eggs, olives, lettuce soaked in brine, see urchins. Prima mensa, main course roasted boar, stuffed dormice, flamingo tongues, stewed hare. Secunda mensa, dessert dates, honey cakes, nuts, cheese, and fruit. These dishes were often coated in sauces made from garum, a fermented fish paste that smelled like rotten anchovies but was considered a delicacy. Pliny the Elder even described certain versions of garum as more expensive than perfume. Apicius, the Roman cookbook author and likely a fictional amalgamation, provides recipes for dishes so elaborate they sound satirical. Boiled ostrich with date sauce, sow's wombs, stuffed nightingales. What's fascinating isn't just the ingredients. It's how status was embedded in consumption. The more inedible or rare the item, the more impressive the host appeared. It wasn't about taste. It was about access. There's a dull but critical truth hidden beneath these banquets. Food preservation was hard. The ancient world lacked refrigeration, and transportation was risky. Much of the excess, the heavy salting, pickling, fermenting, was about managing scarcity and rot, not just showing off. Roman cooks relied on a limited palette of spices, mostly imported from Asia and Africa. Pepper, cumin, and coriander appeared frequently. Sweets came from honey, not sugar, and everything was seasoned aggressively to mask spoilage. These culinary choices were practical responses to the fragility of empire. A fig from Syria might spoil before reaching Rome. A fish caught in Spain might rot before crossing Gaul. So the Romans built preservation into the meal itself. The extravagance wasn't just vanity, it was engineering. And again, vomiting was a standard reaction. Most Romans feared food poisoning far more than they feared overeating. No Roman banquet was complete without wine, and no Roman wine was consumed without dilution. Undiluted wine was considered barbaric, even dangerous. It was associated with madness and foreignness, especially among Greeks, Thracians, and Celts. Instead, hosts mixed their wine with water in large communal bowls called cratera. Ratios varied. 3 parts water to 1 part wine was common. The strength of the mixture signaled the tone of the evening. A light dilution encouraged conversation. A strong one hinted at debauchery. But wine, like food, carried risk. Roman vessels were often lined with lead. and their wine was sometimes sweetened with sapa, a syrup boiled down in lead pots. This led to chronic lead poisoning among the upper class, manifesting as infertility, madness, and early death. Some historians even argue that Rome's elite unknowingly drank themselves into collective brain damage over generations. If true, it's one of history's most ironic health crises, a civilization undone not by barbarian swords, but by its dinnerware. Let's return to vomiting, but now with nuance. For a handful of Romans, especially those seeking to impress or flatter their hosts, induced vomiting became a calculated tactic. By vomiting discreetly, they could continue eating without appearing rude, signal their host's generosity. Your food was too good not to overconsume. Demonstrate their own gluttony as a form of wealth. Seneca, in his Moral Letters, condemns this behavior, describing it as emblematic of moral decay. They vomit so that they may eat, and eat so that they may vomit. But even in his writing, it's clear these were outliers, not norms. Vomiting was shameful, indulgent, and associated with personal weakness. It was tolerated, not institutionalized. And crucially, there was no vomitorium in the dining room. If elite dining was performance art, plebeian meals were survival strategy. Most Romans ate communally in papyni, simple taverns serving porridge, lentils, and watered wine. The risk of foodborne illness was high. Sanitation was poor. And yet, the common people navigated this with resilience, developing iron stomachs, home remedies, and skepticism of anything too rich or unfamiliar. They heard tales of the elite's excesses. Sometimes they witnessed them. But mostly, they lived their lives on the edge of hunger, disease, and taxation. Their experience grounds a myth. In a world where most barely ate enough to survive, the idea of vomiting food to make room for more wasn't just shocking. It was alien. The vomitorium myth persists because it gives us a clean allegory for historical decline. But the real story is more mundane and more revealing. Roman excess wasn't about vomitoria. It was about logistics, social power, and subtle manipulation of appearances. It was the overpreservation of stale food, the layering of sauces to disguise age, and the careful performance of status at every table. To understand the Roman banquet is not to understand gluttony. It's to understand how power is eaten, swallowed, and digested, ritually, symbolically, and sometimes tragically. If Roman banquets were about performance, then who was the real audience? The guests at the table, or the empire watching from below? In our previous sections, we explored the architectural myth of the vomitorium and uncovered the structured chaos of Roman dining, an elaborate performance of hierarchy, control, and indulgence. Now, in this final section, we ask a deeper question. Did what Rome ate and how it ate actually shape the fate of the empire? We'll examine how dietary habits, social rituals, and slow burn toxicity created more than indigestion. They became metaphors and mechanisms for society unraveling. By the 3rd century CE, Rome was no longer the nimble republic it had once been. It was a bloated imperial machine, sprawling from the Scottish highlands to the deserts of Arabia. With that growth came new demands to feed more people, entertain more elites, and consolidate more power through spectacle. And what better spectacle than the imperial feast? Emperors like Elagabalus and Commodus elevated the banquet to surreal levels. Elagabalus reportedly served fake foods made from wax or marble just to mock his guests' expectations. Released wild animals during dinner for shock and entertainment. Used rose petals to smother guests, allegedly fatally, and a stunk on wrong. Was this madness, or was it a reflection of a culture stretching itself too far? A society that needed constant novelty just to feel anything? By this time, the banquet had become both symbol and symptom. It reflected the widening gap between elite fantasy and public reality. While the emperors feasted, the plebs grew restless. Food shortages were increasingly common. Grain imports from North Africa and Egypt could be delayed by storms, piracy, or political sabotage. And because bread was currency, the scarcity led to riots. In 190 CE, a food shortage in Rome caused such unrest that the people nearly stormed the Palatine Hill. The emperor at the time, Commodus, responded not with reform, but with public feasts and gladiatorial games. It worked for a time, but it revealed a dangerous trend, using food as pacification. The infamous phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, was coined not as praise but as criticism. Roman satirist Juvenal wrote, "The people who once handed out military commands, high civil office, legions, everything, now restrain themselves and hope for just two things, bread and circuses." In other words, a full stomach had replaced citizenship. Let's return to something seemingly small. Wine. As mentioned in Section 2, Roman wine was often stored in lead-lined vessels. Boiling down grape must in lead pots was common, especially when making sweeteners like sapa, and lead is a neurotoxin. Modern historians and archaeologists have studied Roman skeletal remains, finding elevated lead levels, especially among elites. Some scholars argue this contributed to decreased fertility, neurological damage, mood disorders and aggression, a decline in cognitive function over generations. This theory is debated, of course, but it's haunting. The very tools used to signify sophistication, silver goblets, sweet wine, cosmetics, may have eroded the biological foundation of the ruling class. If Rome did eat itself, it wasn't in a single feast. It was a slow poisoning, hidden in ritual and reinforced by tradition. As the empire fractured in the 4th and 5th centuries, so too did its banqueting culture. In the eastern provinces, Christian influence transformed the purpose of meals. Fasting, abstinence, and simplicity replaced indulgence. In the West, economic collapse meant even elites struggled to source exotic ingredients. The convivium gave way to the agape, the Christian love feast. Lavishness was replaced with modesty. The table became a place of charity, not power. And in this transition, the vomitorium myth began to fade, not because it was debunked, but because no one had the appetite for it anymore. So, how did the vomitorium myth re-enter the popular imagination? Primarily through Victorian literature and 20th century pop culture. Writers seeking to dramatize Rome's fall latched onto the image of overstuffed aristocrats vomiting between courses. Hollywood ran with it. From Ben-Hur to Caligula, the trope appeared again and again. The myth endures because it's satisfying. It's clean. It gives us a moral fable. Rome fell because it overindulged. But as we've seen, the truth is more complex. Rome didn't collapse in a single vomitous binge. It starved, rioted, poisoned itself, and lost interest in the rituals that once held it together. The vomitorium was never real, but it tells a real story. Today, we live in a world where food is once again deeply political. Who eats what, how it's sourced, how it's presented. These questions dominate global discourse, from supply chain fragility to obesity epidemics. The parallels are uncomfortable. We, too, are building myths around our consumption, sometimes to excuse, sometimes to criticize. But maybe the most boring truth of all is that food is history's most consistent mirror. It reveals what a society values, what it fears, and what it chooses to ignore. The vomitorium never existed, but the desire for excess, followed by denial, has always been real. If we mythologize the past to feel superior to it, what unexamined myths might future historians uncover about us? It began, as so many Roman stories do, with fear cloaked in marble. You are an honored guest. At least, that's what you're told. A finely robed slave escorts you through darkened halls lit only by oil lamps, each flickering against the polished stone like a signal fire. The air smells of cedarwood, wine, and something faintly metallic. You are here by invitation, but you don't know why. No one ever really knew why. At the center of this quiet drama sits the man himself, Domitian, Emperor of Rome from 81 to 96 E. He greets you not with a smile, but a stare, calm, cold, and calculating. Welcome to a private dinner under one of the most paranoid rulers the empire ever endured. Tonight, nothing is certain except the menu, and maybe not even that. To understand this strange dinner, you must first understand the man hosting it. Domitian, son of Vespasian and younger brother to beloved Titus, rose to power in the shadow of more popular rulers. He ruled for 15 years, longer than most Roman emperors, a reign marked by authoritarian control, administrative reform, and rising tyranny. Unlike the flamboyant Nero or the unpredictable Caligula, Domitian was coldly efficient, a lover of order and formality. He increased grain distribution to the poor, built monumental structures like the Arch of Titus, and revalued Roman currency. But he was also deeply suspicious of senators, philosophers, generals, even family. He preferred solitude. He trusted astrologers. He executed people for dreaming of his death. And above all, he loved to control the scene. One of the strangest tales of Domitian's reign is what historians now call the Black Banquet. Suetonius, the famed Roman biographer, recounted a chilling episode in the 12 Caesars. Domitian invited several senators to a banquet, but not just any meal. The entire dining room was draped in black. The ceiling, the couches, the tablecloths, even the servants' clothing. The lamps burned with eerie, smoky oil. No food was served at first, only the sound of water dripping in a fountain designed to resemble a funeral urn. Each guest was greeted not by name, but by the title Mortis Est, he is dead. Then, in silence, a bare meal was served. Bland vegetables, cold meat, unsweetened wine. No entertainment, no conversation. Only Domitian watching, and when the guests were dismissed without explanation, they returned home to find funerary gifts waiting in their homes. Urns, shrouds, and candles. No one was executed that night, but everyone thought they might be. This banquet wasn't about food. It was about dominance, a symbolic execution meant to remind Rome's elite. You are alive because I allow it. Domitian's reign was full of these psychological tactics. He renamed months after himself. He revived Maiesta's laws, under which even minor insults to the emperor were treated as treason. Whispered dissent became a capital offense. In this climate, even a dinner invitation could be a death sentence, or worse, a test. The only correct response was silent compliance. To show fear was weakness. To show confidence was arrogance. Either could be fatal. Historians often ask, was Domitian mad or merely shrewd? The truth is probably more boring. He was a ruler whose fear of conspiracy exceeded his grip on reality, and he used meals, rituals, and architecture to remind others of their mortality. Control extended from coinage to cutlery. One reason Roman elites feared imperial dinners was poison, a method of murder as old as the Republic itself. The court of Domitian, like those of Claudius and Nero before him, was infamous for its tasters, cupbearers, and whispered allegations. By Domitian's time, poison had become a language of politics. It was untraceable, elegant, deniable. Seneca called the most Roman of deaths. It was a weapon of those who couldn't risk open rebellion, but still needed a result. To counter this, emperors developed elaborate safety rituals. Food was pre-tasted by slaves. Water was drawn from hidden, guarded wells. Dishes were made of materials thought to detect poison, like silver or crystal. Astrologers and haruspices were consulted before each meal. In Domitian's case, these precautions were routinely rehearsed, not just out of caution, but obsession. He once had an entire batch of figs thrown out because a dream suggested treachery. He even ordered palace food stored in lead-sealed amphorae, believing it would protect him. Ironically, that same lead may have contributed to his paranoia. The most dangerous thing about dining with Domitian wasn't death. It was the knowledge that death was a possibility. He turned the very act of hospitality into a performance of dread. In Rome, the convivium had always been a place of bonding. To break bread was to forge trust. Domitian inverted that. He made dinner a theater of loyalty, where your continued existence was the final course. This tactic worked, until it didn't. Fear, after all, is a short-term strategy. And by the end of his reign, Domitian had alienated the Senate, the army, and even members of his own household. In 96 CE, he was assassinated, stabbed in the groin by a palace steward. The Senate, fearing instability, immediately damned his memory, damnatio memoriae, and erased his name from public records and monuments. Even in death, Domitian was denied the dignity of the Roman table. Centuries later, the Black Banquet would be cited in early modern political philosophy, appearing in works discussing tyranny, psychological manipulation, and the fine line between spectacle and statecraft. In many ways, Domitian's eerie meal anticipated a truth about power. It doesn't have to kill you to destroy you. Sometimes, all it needs to do is invite you to dinner. When the ritual of hospitality becomes a weapon of fear, does it still matter what's on the plate? Domitian's infamous Black Banquet was not an isolated performance. It was a logical expression of a reign built on precision, ritual, and surveillance. To understand what that dinner meant in context, we must now look deeper at how food, ritual, and fear became mechanisms of state control in the Flavian dynasty. Because Domitian didn't just feed his guests, he starved Rome of trust. By the time Domitian took power in 81 CE, Rome had already suffered through Nero's theatrical narcissism and the bloody year of the Four Emperors. His father, Vespasian, had stabilized the empire with military discipline and fiscal conservatism. His brother, Titus, died young but was adored for his role in completing the Colosseum and responding to disasters like the eruption of Vesuvius. Domitian inherited power with a chip on his shoulder and a plan. He ruled with a rigid administrative style, exacting taxes, standardizing currency, reforming land surveys, and micromanaging provincial governors. These reforms were effective, but also deeply unpopular among the senatorial class, who saw their autonomy and wealth slowly stripped away. To secure his position, Domitian constructed a web of informants, astrologers, and secret police. And like all totalitarian systems, this network extended into the private sphere, including, most chillingly, the dining room. The Roman convivium was always political. Who was invited, what was served, who reclined where, these were all encoded signs of status, allegiance, and favor. Domitian turned these symbols into a minefield. It was said that no senator could decline an imperial dinner without suspicion. To refuse an invitation was seen as potential dissent. To attend and speak too freely was worse. And to joke at the emperor's expense, even privately, could result in sudden arrest. In one case, a senator was executed simply for naming a favorite slave after Lucius Domitius, Domitian's birth name. In another, a philosopher was exiled for toasting to liberty in what was supposed to be a private meal. These anecdotes reveal profound tension. Meals were no longer about nourishment or even luxury. They were about surveillance. You were not dining with the emperor. You were being tested by him. It wasn't just one banquet that bore symbolic weight. Many of Domitian's dinners followed a careful choreography of tension and release. Guests were often kept waiting for hours, unsure whether they were being honored or humiliated. Seating arrangements would shift at the last minute. A senator invited to recline near the emperor one week might be placed near the slaves the next. Entertainment was often interrupted, abruptly canceled, or replaced with ominous poetry readings that hinted at betrayal and fate. In this way, every meal became an unstable ritual, a performance of power meant to keep the elite uncertain, off balance, and deeply aware of their vulnerability. This wasn't madness. It was method. In such a world, trust was gone, even between emperors and their cooks. Domitian employed multiple layers of food security. Food tasters, often slaves, consumed small portions of each dish in full view of the emperor. Drink testers performed the same ritual with wine, often from multiple amphorae. Cupbearers were rotated frequently, their background scrutinized. In rare cases, Domitian even forbade dishes prepared outside the palace kitchen, believing outsiders might bribe cooks or poison ingredients. The irony was inescapable. The more Domitian tried to protect himself, the more he revealed how vulnerable he truly felt. In protecting his body, he exposed his mind. The most toxic thing at these dinners wasn't the food. It was the erosion of private thought. Imagine attending a banquet where your laughter could be misinterpreted, where your silence could be too quiet, where even your appetite might be suspect. Did you eat too little? Are you ill or cautious? Did you eat too much? Are you mocking imperial generosity? In such conditions, self-censorship becomes survival, and self-censorship over time becomes self-destruction. The senators stopped joking. The poets stopped writing. The generals stopped trusting their lieutenants. And Domitian, in his hunger for order, starved the empire of vitality. Domitian's architectural projects reflected the same paranoid precision as his dinners. Consider the Domus Flavia, his sprawling palace on the Palatine Hill. It included the Aula Regia, a grand throne room with a raised platform and controlled sightlines, A hidden staircase allowing Domitian to escape or spy from above. A private triclinium lined with sound-absorbing marble, perfect for quiet conversations or interrogations during dinner. These spaces were built to manage perception. Nothing was casual. Even the light in the dining room was manipulated, often filtered through alabaster to cast an ethereal glow. Domitian understood what modern rulers would later master. The setting of power is as potent as the power itself. Over time, though, even this rigid machinery began to falter. By the early 90s CE, rumors spread that Domitian had begun eating alone, refusing guests, and only dining after personally inspecting every ingredient. His circle of trust narrowed. Executions increased. Senators withdrew. The final straw? Domitian demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. It was no longer enough to be feared. He wanted to be worshipped. The result was predictable. Assassins were recruited not from the Senate, but from his own household, people who had for years served him dinner. The very rituals meant to protect him became his undoing. If every meal becomes a test of loyalty, can an empire ever truly be nourished? The table is set, but there are no guests. By the final years of his reign, Emperor Domitian, once a calculating host, a patron of architecture and control, no longer trusted the very rituals he had built. The triclinium, once a stage for his silent dominance, now sat empty most nights. He dined alone, surrounded by shadows and silence, with only a handful of trembling servants permitted to pour his wine or touch his food. This is not just a story of an emperor. It's a story of how power eats itself. In 96 CE, a conspiracy finally broke through the layers of surveillance. Domitian's paranoia had grown so intense that he repeatedly consulted astrologers, demanding to know the date of his death. One prediction, at noon. From that point onward, he reportedly grew anxious around midday, checking the time obsessively, avoiding contact. But he missed a real threat, one that had no stars to guide it. The final blow came not from the Senate or the army, but from inside his own home. The plot involved his chamberlain Parthenius, a freedman named Stephanus, and members of his court. One version of the story, reported by Cassius Dio and Suetonius, suggests that Domitian's food tasters and attendants were deliberately kept away the day of the assassination. At the emperor's last breakfast, his wine was poured and his bread was served, but no one else ate. Domitian was reportedly superstitious, to the point of obsession. He avoided mirrors, birds, and omens he deemed unfavorable. He had rooms lined with reflective surfaces, not to admire himself, but to watch for assassins. He even reinforced his bedroom ceiling with polished tiles, so he could see anyone approaching from behind. And yet, on the morning of his death, these precautions failed. A servant allegedly lied to him about the time, say it was past noon, so he would lower his guard. Moments later, Stephanus, pretending to bring a list of traitors, pulled a dagger from under his tunic and stabbed the emperor. Domitian fought back, but was ultimately overpowered. He died alone on the cold floor of his own palace. No ritual, no feast, just silence. Following his death, the Senate rejoiced. They declared damnatio memoriae, the formal erasure of Domitian's memory. His statues were torn down. His name was scratched off public inscriptions. His image was defaced with chisels. Even the spaces where he dined, the black marble halls, the banquet chambers, the personal dining rooms of the Domus Flavia, were either renamed or left to decay. His feast, once feared, became an empty table in the historical record. But the irony is sharp. The very rituals Domitian used to dominate others were what allowed history to forget him. No poetic tributes, no commemorative meals, just a whisper of cruelty and a tale of the dinner no one wanted to attend. Yet Domitian's reign wasn't a total descent into madness. He stabilized the currency, improved provincial governance, built awe-inspiring structures, and maintained the borders of the empire with strict efficiency. What doomed him wasn't policy, it was atmosphere. He created a world where no one felt safe to speak, let alone eat, where loyalty was suspect, where hospitality, Rome's most sacred virtue, was weaponized. And so, when he fell, there were no mourners. Not because they hated him necessarily, but because they had forgotten how to feel anything at all. The dinner table in Roman culture was sacred, a place of convivium, a coming together of people, ideas, and identities. It was where alliances were forged, literature was read aloud, and new citizens were introduced to the rhythms of Roman life. Domitian corrupted that space. He turned it into a platform of punishment, a ritual of dread. And in doing so, he unwound one of the invisible threads that held Roman society together: trust at the table. His reign, while prosperous on the surface, shows us something crucial about power. When fear replaces fellowship, even an empire cannot feast in peace. After Domitian, successive emperors like Nerva and Trajan intentionally reversed the tone of imperial banquets. They invited critics. They held public dinners. They encouraged laughter, poetry, and wine. This wasn't just image repair. It was a counter-ritual, a reassertion of what the convivium was meant to be. Not a test, but a toast. Domitian's ghost still lingered in the architecture, but the empire, in its slow and stumbling way, tried to move on. When fear passes as formality and ritual becomes oppression, how long before even the grandest feast leaves everyone starving? Imagine, if you will, the perfect Roman afternoon. A vineyard stretches across a sun-washed hillside in Campania. The vines are heavy with ripe grapes. Slaves work the presses. Amphorae line the walls of a cool cellar. And inside a nobleman's villa, silver cups are filled to the brim with deep red, syrupy wine, thick, sweet, and intoxicating. But something is wrong, not with the taste. The Romans had perfected their palate for wine. No, what's wrong is invisible, microscopic, silent. It sits in the syrup. It lines the vessel. It lives in the air. This wine, this perfect cup of imperial joy, is slowly killing the people who drink it, and no one knows. To understand how wine became both a gift and a curse, you must first understand its centrality in Roman life. Romans didn't just drink wine. They depended on it. It was safer than water. It was prescribed as medicine. It accompanied every meal, every sacrifice, every political negotiation. To refuse wine was to reject civilization itself. Roman authors like Pliny the Elder, Columella, and Cato the Elder wrote extensively about viticulture, how to grow, press, ferment, and age wine. Vineyards were engineered with obsessive detail. Wine was stored in amphorae sealed with pitch, resin, or clay. It was flavored with herbs, honey, or even seawater. But most importantly, Roman wine was almost always cooked. The must, the juice of the crushed grape, was boiled down into a syrup called sapa or defrutum. This sweet, concentrated liquid preserved the wine longer and gave it that rich, raisin-like flavor so prized by Roman connoisseurs. The problem? It was often boiled in lead pots. Lead, or plumbum, was a common material in the Roman world. It was everywhere, in pipes, hence the term plumbing, cookware, cosmetics, and wine production. Romans valued lead for several reasons. It was cheap and easy to mine. It was malleable, perfect for lining containers and shaping into utensils. It didn't affect the color of wine or food. And most importantly, it sweetened the taste. When grape must was boiled in lead vessels, a chemical reaction occurred, producing lead acetate, historically referred to as sugar of lead. This compound was remarkably sweet, enhancing the flavor of wine, making it seem more refined and expensive. To the Roman palate, it was a sign of sophistication. To modern science, it's a neurotoxin. Chronic lead exposure doesn't kill instantly. It's slow, cumulative, and subtle. Over time, it can cause memory loss and cognitive decline, irritability and mood disorders, infertility and miscarriage, kidney damage, tremors and muscular weakness, hallucinations and psychosis. These symptoms were rarely diagnosed in the ancient world. There was no concept of heavy metal toxicity. Instead, Romans would see the effects as aging, divine punishment, or mental instability. But archaeological evidence, from bones unearthed in Roman cemeteries, tells another story. Skeletal remains of Roman elites show alarmingly high levels of lead, especially in comparison to those of lower social classes or people living in non-Romanized regions. In other words, the rich were poisoning themselves faster. The irony is bitter. Wine preserved in lead-laced amphorae, was a status symbol. The sweetened taste was a marker of refinement. Elaborate recipes, preserved in Apicius and other texts, call for adding defrutum to everything from roast to desserts. And elite Romans drank more of it than anyone. Lower classes drank cheaper wine, often sour, often unfiltered, and often diluted. It wasn't boiled in lead pots. It wasn't stored in sealed silver jugs. It was rough, raw, and relatively safer. The wealthy, in their pursuit of sophistication, literally paid for sweeter poison. Some ancient thinkers suspected that certain materials cause illness. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, notes that lead fumes are dangerous, particularly in mining. Vitruvius, the Roman architect, explicitly warned against using lead pipes for water. He observed that clay pipes were healthier, while water from lead conduits could cause pallor and sickness. But these observations never coalesced into public policy or medical consensus. Why? Because the taste outweighed the risk, and because the effects were slow, non-uniform, and culturally invisible. An emperor going mad? That was divine punishment. A senator going sterile? That was fate. A child dying early? The gods. Lead was never the suspect, until it was far too late. It's tempting to look back at Rome's more unhinged emperors and draw a straight line to lead poisoning. Modern scholars have speculated that Caligula's erratic behavior, Nero's cruelty, and even Domitian's paranoia could have been influenced by long-term neurotoxicity. But the historical record is murky. These men ruled in violent, high-stress environments. They were raised in privilege, surrounded by sycophants, and trained in cruelty. Madness had many causes. Still, it's hard to ignore the pattern. Their behaviors, delusion, cruelty, paranoia, impulse, mirror many symptoms of lead toxicity. And in the imperial court, wine flowed like water. What happens to civilization when its sweetest pleasures are also its slowest poisons? By now, you know that Roman wine often carried more than just a taste of grape and garum-seasoned roast boar. It carried a neurotoxic trace of empire, lead, boiled down with the sweetness of luxury, disguised behind status and ritual. But wine wasn't the only problem. Lead was everywhere in Roman daily life. From aqueducts to bathhouses, kitchens to cosmetics, tombstones to temple roofs, this soft metal formed the literal infrastructure of the empire. It was so common, so convenient, and so unregulated that its dangers remained invisible for centuries. This section explores how lead crept through the veins of Rome, not just in cups, but in water, food, and even makeup. The question is no longer whether the Romans were poisoned. It's how thoroughly and how quietly it happened. Lead's Latin name, plumbum, gives us words like plumbing plumber and plumb line. The Romans extracted it in huge quantities, especially from mines in Hispania, modern-day Spain, Gaul, and Britannia. At its peak, the empire produced over 80,000 tons of lead annually. The uses were almost endless. Pipes. Lead was the go-to material for water pipes in homes, bathhouses, and fountains. It was flexible, durable, and easy to shape. Cooking utensils. Frying pans, ladles, and wine strainers were commonly made of lead or lead alloys. Glazing. Ceramic storage jars were coated with lead-based glazes to prevent leakage. Solder. Used to seal joints in bronze or copper vessels. Paint pigments. Lead, white, and red were used in frescoes, statues, and even wall coatings. Makeup. Roman women wore cerussa, a face powder made from white lead, to achieve a pale complexion. Each of these uses brought daily, low-level exposure to one of the most dangerous elements known to modern science. And no one saw it coming. For centuries, historians have debated whether Rome's famous aqueducts and plumbing systems contributed significantly to public lead poisoning. Here's what we know. Aqueducts themselves were typically made of stone, brick, or terracotta, not lead. But once water entered urban areas, it often ran through lead pipes to reach fountains, homes, and public baths. Inscriptions from across the empire proudly display plumbum, the imperial stamp of approved lead pipes. The big question, was this water dangerous? Some scholars argue that constant water flow reduced the risk, as mineral deposits built up inside the pipes and acted as a barrier. Others counter that soft water, low in minerals, could dissolve lead ions into the drinking supply. A 2014 study published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that Roman tap water had up to 100 times more lead than natural spring water. That level of contamination, sustained over a lifetime, could result in cognitive decline, kidney damage, reproductive issues, bone weakness, stillbirths. In short, even if it didn't kill instantly, it quietly eroded public health, especially among the urban elite who had the most access to piped water. The Romans believed beauty was a sign of inner virtue. Women of status wore white face powder, black kohl eyeliner, and red lead lipstick. The goal was a pale, refined complexion, free from the sun-darkened skin of slaves and laborers. But the ingredients were deadly. Cerussa. This white face powder was made by soaking lead sheets in vinegar. The resulting compound, basic lead carbonate, was then ground into a soft powder and applied directly to the skin. Red lead, used on the lips and cheeks. Lead-based eyeliner, applied close to the tear ducts where it could easily enter the bloodstream. Repeated exposure caused hair loss, skin ulcers, vision problems, neurological symptoms, premature aging. Some Roman writers even warned against these products. Pliny the Elder noted that Cerussa ruined the skin over time. But as with wine, the beauty standard outweighed the risk. To be seen was to be pale, and to be pale was to be poisoned. Lead's reach extended beyond food and water. Cooking pots, stews, sauces, and boiling water often came into contact with lead cookware. Storage. Wine and oils were stored in lead-glazed ceramics or lead-stopped amphorae. Baby bottles. Some clay nursing bottles have been found lined with lead glazes. Beds and cribs. Wealthy families used leaded paints and dyes to decorate nurseries. And because children absorb lead more readily than adults, the damage to developing brains was worse. Symptoms included stunted growth, hyperactivity, learning disabilities, early death. In elite Roman households, where children were nursed by slaves, fed rich foods, and surrounded by painted toys and cups, the risk of chronic exposure was severe. And yet, when children died, often before the age of 10, it was seen as tragic but normal. This is the most controversial question. Did lead poisoning play a measurable role in the fall of the Roman Empire? Some 20th century historians, like Jerome Riagu, argued that chronic exposure among the elite led to mental instability among emperors, falling birth rates, infertility among noble families, a weakening of administrative competency. Critics of this theory argue that lead exposure likely varied across the empire. Many cultures used lead without collapsing. Rome's fall was due to complex political, military, and economic factors. The truth, as always, is somewhere in the boring middle. Lead poisoning likely didn't cause the fall, but it may have exacerbated internal weaknesses, making leaders slower to respond, more erratic, and less fertile. It hollowed out the ruling class quietly, steadily, and irreversibly. When the empire finally split and shrank, much of Rome's infrastructure fell into disrepair. Ironically, this reduced lead exposure for many communities. By the early Middle Ages, wine was still common, but the frutum had faded from use. Makeup styles changed. Terracotta replaced lead pipes. The slow toxin of civilization dissipated, but Rome's legacy lingered. For centuries, European elites continued using lead-based cosmetics. In 18th century England, women died from lead face paint. In 19th century France, lead starch collars caused seizures. Rome had shown the way. If civilization teaches us to refine what we consume, how do we know when the refinement has become rot? The banquet halls have emptied. The vineyards of Campania still bloom, but the amphorae are cracked. The song of Rome's viticulture, its pride, its art, its quiet engine of wealth, has fallen strangely silent. By the time the Western Roman Empire officially collapsed in 476 CE, Rome's wine culture had already begun to decay, not from famine or fire, but from a poison it never understood. This section explores how wine, once Rome's greatest symbol of life and refinement, became a metaphor for its slow, imperceptible rot, not in drama, but in dull, unexamined consequence. At its peak, Roman viticulture extended across Italy, Southern Gaul, modern France. Hispania, modern Spain. North Africa. Balkans and Asia Minor. Elite Roman villas were often centered around wine production. Entire economies were built on grape exportation. Roman coins featured grape clusters. Roman law regulated vineyard sizes, pruning techniques, and harvest protocols. But by the 4th and 5th century CE, trade routes were breaking down due to internal instability and external pressures. Landowners increasingly abandoned their villas under threat of barbarian raids or local revolts. Labor shortages from war, plague, and the outlawing of slavery in some Christianized provinces left vines untended. Regional climate shifts and soil exhaustion reduced yields. In this declining context, wine became scarce. The complex process of defrutum making faded. Lead boiling was no longer economical. And with that, the sweetest wine, the deadliest, slowly disappeared. Another factor in the decline of Rome's toxic wine culture was the rise of Christianity. As the church gained power, moral views around food and drink began to change. Excessive drinking was increasingly condemned. Lavish banquets were associated with pagan decadence. Christian fasting rituals, simple meals, and wine used only in sacred contexts replaced the Roman convivium. Monasteries became the new centers of viticulture, but their wines were different. Less sweet, less syrupy, more focused on preservation and liturgy than luxury. The production of defrutum boiled in lead cauldrons nearly vanished by the early Middle Ages. The empire had not been cured, but it had forgotten the taste of its poison. Let's return to the original question. Did lead poisoning bring down Rome? No, not alone, but it did something more insidious. It dulled the mind. It fogged the senses. It compromised fertility and child health. It amplified the madness of men already raised in violence. It made the powerful slower, the wise less wise, the ambitious more erratic. It did not cause Rome's collapse. It softened the pillars so they cracked more easily. It turned senators into infertile echoes. It turned emperors into paranoid husks. It turned the banquet into a theater of decline. And it did all this without fanfare, without war, without fire, just a little sweetness, sipped daily, until no one remembered what they had lost. Modern excavations across the Roman world continue to uncover amphorae with lead-sealed spouts, ceramic residues with trace amounts of lead acetate, skeletons of elites with toxic metal accumulation in bone tissue. What's missing is awareness. There's no Roman term for lead poisoning. No diagnosis, no scroll warning of Sapa's dangers. Even the greatest minds, Galen, Celsus, Pliny, saw symptoms but missed the source. And in that blindness lies the cautionary tale. Today, we live in a world equally enamored with refinement. Processed foods sweetened to perfection. Plastics and microtoxins in our water. Heavy metals in cosmetics, e-waste, and urban soil. Pollution dressed as progress. We, too, believe our systems are too sophisticated to fail. We, too, trust that beauty and taste can't betray us. And we, too, may one day discover that the slowest poisons are the hardest to notice until they've already done their work. Rome doesn't just teach us about empires. It teaches us how civilizations decline without knowing they are declining. Roman wine, real Roman wine, was never about getting drunk. It was about ceremony, about control, about signaling class, and reinforcing ritual. It was a performance of culture, a slow dance of sweetness and rot. When you raise a glass today, whether wine, water, or whatever your civilization drinks to feel safe, ask yourself what's in it, not just in chemistry, but in meaning, because even the most refined tastes may carry within them the seed of something quiet, corrosive, and utterly ordinary. When decline tastes like luxury, how long before we forget what survival was supposed to taste like? There's a common image we have of the Roman Empire. Mighty aqueducts, marble columns, togas in the breeze. Maybe a chariot or two. But here's a question that rarely makes it into the textbooks. Where did all these Romans go to go? And when they did, who did they pray to? Because in Rome, sanitation wasn't just a question of plumbing. It was a ritual, a public performance, and, oddly enough, a religious act. They had toilet gods. They had dinner rules about urination. They had shared sponges, and they lived with smells we cannot imagine today. This section opens a lid, so to speak, on how Romans handled their bodily waste, and what that tells us about how they viewed order, purity, and power. Let's begin with the basics. Public latrines, or latrini. By the height of the empire, major Roman cities had extensive public sanitation infrastructure, including sewer systems, most famously the Cloaca Maxima, indoor plumbing in wealthy homes, public fountains in baths, and, yes, large communal toilet buildings. These latrines weren't private booths. Instead, they featured long benches with holes, placed over a constant stream of water that carried waste away. There were no partitions, no stalls, just a row of holes, sometimes 20 or more side by side. If you needed to go, you sat down next to your neighbor and made conversation. This wasn't considered odd. In fact, communal defecation was a social norm, especially among men. Business deals were discussed, politics debated, gossip exchanged, and below your feet, the water never stopped flowing. Now comes a question of hygiene. Without toilet paper, what did Romans use? Enter the dorsorium, a sea sponge attached to a stick, kept in a bucket of water or vinegar. When you finished your business, you dipped it, wiped yourself, and left it for the next person. It was essentially a communal reusable toilet brush. In theory, vinegar or salt water kept it sanitary. In practice, infections and parasites were rampant. Occasionally, people would bring their own sponge or cloth, especially the wealthy. But in most public latrines, you shared. And to the Romans, that wasn't disgusting. It was just civic life. Roman religion didn't shy away from the body's functions. They had deities for everything, including Sterculius or Stercutus, god of manure and fertilization. Cloacina, goddess of the sewer system, especially the Cloaca Maxima. Crepitus, a whispered, likely joking god of flatulence, used in satire. Cloacina was more than a name. She had an actual shrine, situated near the Roman Forum. Prayers to Cloacina were part of ritual cleansing. In fact, one Roman coin shows two men beside her shrine, indicating she wasn't just myth, she was honored. The sacredness extended to the act of elimination. It was seen as part of the balance of nature, the humoral theory of health, and even the structure of the cosmos. Going to the toilet wasn't dirty. It was just life. Despite all this openness in public spaces, Romans were careful about how bodily functions were discussed at the table. The cena, or dinner, was a place of structured conversation. Certain topics were avoided. Even though guests reclined, bodily functions like belching or passing gas were considered vulgar, especially if done loudly or intentionally. Pliny the Elder once wrote about people who could control their farts so carefully they did it for sport. But most Romans avoided such topics when dining. Elite households had lavatories close to triclinium, but they were discreetly separated by corridors or screens. The contradiction was clear. In public, defecate next to your neighbor. Talk freely. At dinner, keep your bodily functions to yourself. Sanitation, like all things in Rome, was about context and performance. One of the most curious facts in Roman sanitation history is the value of urine. That's right, urine was valuable. It was used by fullers, the workers who cleaned and whitened woolen garments. The ammonia in urine acted as a natural detergent, breaking down grease and restoring color. Fullers collected urine from public urinals, Forica, and paid a fee to the state. In the 1st century CE, Emperor Vespasian instituted the urine tax, the vectigal urini. Public urinals were set up, and the collectors paid the empire to gather it. When his son Titus mocked the policy, Vespasian allegedly held up a coin and said, "Pecunia non olet," money does not stink. The phrase has survived to this day. Despite this infrastructure, Roman sanitation was far from sterile. Latrines often teemed with parasites, including lice, fleas, worms, flies. Drainage systems clogged easily. Waste backed up into fountains. Rats proliferated. Disease spread, especially in crowded tenement blocks where private latrines were rare. Doctors like Galen and Celsus advocated for frequent purging, enemas, and herbal treatments, but the reality was grimmer. Even elite homes often had chamber pots emptied by slaves into the street drains or just out the window. Urine, feces, and waste were never far from daily life. What does it say about a civilization when its gods live in the sewer, and its cleanest rituals happen in a room full of strangers? We've already peeked into Roman toilets, shared tersorium or two, and met deities who ruled over sewers and dung heaps. But to the Romans, cleanliness wasn't just about excretion. It was a broader idea, a ritual performance, part of daily life that shaped identity, health class, and morality. In this section, we delve into more structured side of Roman hygiene. The bathhouse, the doctor's table, and the deeply ingrained habits that tried, often unsuccessfully, to manage the human body in public life. Because for all their engineering brilliance, the Romans still had worms. The Roman thermae, public bathhouses, were architectural marvels and central to Roman daily life. These complexes were vast, often including a podaterium, the changing room, tepidarium, warm room, caldarium, hot steam room, frigidarium, cold plunge pool, laconicum, dry sweating room, palestra, open courtyard for exercise, libraries, gardens, food stalls, and lecture halls. Bathing wasn't a private matter. It was communal, ritualistic, and expected. Some citizens visited the baths daily, especially in the afternoon. Even the poorest Romans, with no private plumbing, could access clean water and hot steam for a small fee, or for free on state-sponsored days. Here, they didn't just scrub and soak. They networked, debated, made deals, recited poetry, and courted lovers. Romans didn't use bar soap as we know it. Instead, they employed the strigil, a curved metal tool used to scrape oil, dirt, and sweat from the skin after applying scented olive oil. Here's the typical routine. Exercise in the palestra. Oil up the body, sometimes performed by a slave. Use the strigil to scrape off grime. Rinse in the warm or cold baths. The result? Cleaner skin, but not necessarily sterile. Baths weren't filtered or chlorinated. They were heated via hypocaust systems, underfloor heating, and filled via aqueducts, but the water could be reused for hours or days. Hair, oils, skin flakes, and bacteria floated freely. Despite this, Romans believed the act of bathing was restorative, even moral. Cleanliness was equated with discipline, order, and health. Underpinning Roman hygiene was a humoral theory of medicine, inherited from the Greeks. According to Galen and others, health depended on the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Illness was caused by imbalances, and treatment often involved manipulating bodily fluids, especially through bloodletting, vomiting emetics, purging laxatives, enemas, sweating via baths or hot rooms. To cleanse a body was not just cosmetic, it was therapeutic. The line between bathroom and clinic was thin. Doctors even prescribed goat dung poultices, urine mouth rinses, and pigeon droppings for inflammation. The logic? Waste could heal. While poor Romans relied on public latrines, wealthier citizens often had private toilets inside their domus. These were simple: a seat over a ceramic pot or small chute leading to a cesspit. Toilets were usually placed near the kitchen for easy disposal of food scraps and waste, adjacent to the kitchen hearth, where heat reduced smell, or tucked discreetly away from guest areas, but not always. In Pompeii, some homes had toilets right next to dining rooms, separated only by a wall. Smells could drift in, but that wasn't a deal breaker. The focus was on efficiency, not elegance. And once full, chamber pots were emptied by slaves, sometimes directly into the street or gutter. Despite all their effort, Romans lived in a world teeming with parasites. Modern archaeological studies of ancient latrine sediments reveal roundworms, tapeworms, whipworms, liver flukes, giardia. The likely culprits? Shared sponges, unwashed hands, dirty water, closed quarters, flies, and, yes, bathing with everyone else. The irony is cruel. Rome had one of the most advanced public sanitation systems of the ancient world. But without understanding germ theory, its finest bathhouses may have spread more illness than they cured. Where water and oil fell short, perfume took over. Romans were obsessed with scent. Sweet oils, incense, and perfumes were imported from Arabia, Egypt, and India. Entire industries existed for making scented ointments for armpits, feet, and even hair. Some highlights. Women used perfume stones tucked in their clothes to mask body odor. Men perfumed their beards and cloaks. Public spaces burned incense to mask urban smells. Rich Romans used lavender, myrrh, and spikenard in their oils. But this wasn't just cosmetic. It was status. To smell good was to broadcast control over your own body. And to be seen as dirty was a form of moral failure, even if you had parasites. Even if your sponge had been used by 40 strangers. As long as you smelled like wealth, the illusion of health remained intact. Rome's obsession with cleaning was never about science. It was about purity, control, and performance of civilization. Bathing equals reset. Oil equals refinement. Perfume equals virtue. Sponge equals civic participation. Sweat equals masculinity. Waste equals a force to be managed, honored, and hidden at the same time. This paradox of ritualized hygiene in a dirty world defined Roman daily life. And in that contradiction lies the key to understanding not just Roman sanitation, but Roman identity. If a civilization performs cleanliness without understanding cleanliness, is it truly clean or merely comforted? The bathhouses have cooled, the amphorae have emptied, and the murmurs in the latrines have gone silent. But Rome's obsession with sanitation, ritual cleansing, and bodily order didn't disappear with the empire. In this final section, we explore how Rome's practical and impractical approach to sanitation shaped the centuries to come, and how the legacy of the Cloaca Maxima still flows beneath our cities, our customs, and even our beliefs about what it means to be clean. Because in Rome, cleanliness was never just physical. It was political, philosophical, religious, and deeply, quietly human. Let's begin with the sewer that made Rome possible. The Cloaca Maxima, or Great Sewer, was one of the earliest engineering feats of the Roman monarchy, begun in the 6th century BC under the Etruscan kings. It was built to drain the marshy valleys between Rome's hills, redirected the Tiber River's overflow, eventually integrated into a full urban sewer system beneath the forum, temples, and marketplaces. Though originally open air, it was later vaulted and enclosed in stone and concrete, becoming a subterranean river of wastewater, runoff, and symbolism. To Romans, it wasn't just infrastructure, it was a divine structure. Cloacina, the goddess of the sewer, was honored at her shrine atop the cloaca. Newlyweds paid homage to her. Purification rituals invoked her. Even the name suggests closeness and cleanliness, from chlora to cleanse. The sewer was sacred and filthy at once. And that duality still exists in how we view our own sanitation systems today. What they got right: running water, aqueducts, cisterns, fountains, water allocation systems for rich and poor, public latrines to reduce street waste, sewage diversion away from population centers, daily bathing habits across all social classes. These accomplishments were unmatched for over 1,000 years. No medieval European city would rival Roman water management until the 19th century. What they got wrong: no understanding of microorganisms or germ theory. Shared sponges, reused water, and close quarters led to spread of disease. Lead pipes and vessels exposed citizens to neurotoxins. Parasite infestations remained rampant despite frequent bathing. Urban planning couldn't keep up with population growth, leading to clogged drains and overflowing cesspits. Rome built the world's first urban plumbing system without understanding what it was fighting. As Christianity spread, Roman rituals of cleansing took on new forms. Baptism replaced ritual washing as a marker of purity. Moral cleanliness became more important than physical. Lavish bathing was increasingly viewed as decadent, sinful, or vain. Monasteries discouraged frequent washing, except for health or humility. The public bathhouses fell into disuse. By the 6th century CE, aqueducts broke down. Latrines were abandoned. The symbolic shift from visible to invisible cleanliness would last for centuries. The Roman equation, clean equals civilized, was replaced with a new one: clean equals modest. Dirty equals divine suffering. It wasn't until the Renaissance and Enlightenment that Europe began to rediscover and partially resurrect Rome's sanitation ethos. There's another dimension worth exploring. Sanitation as a tool of social control. Romans used access to water and waste disposal as a way to structure class, space, and citizenship. Aqueduct water was distributed hierarchically. Senators first, then merchants, then the public. Bathhouses reinforced gender, age, and social norms through designated hours and rooms. Latrines mirrored social order. Some were luxurious, others grim. Toilet taxes, like Vespasian's urine tax, monetized bodily function. Even in the dirt, power remained visible. Your access to cleanliness reflected your place in the empire. This still echoes today in the politics of plumbing, access to clean water, and debates about public restrooms. Sanitation is never just infrastructure. It is always a mirror of inequality. We inherit more than roads and bricks from Rome. We inherit attitudes. The belief that bathing makes you a better citizen. The equation of bad smells with moral failure. The idea that ritual washing can cleanse guilt. The use of public toilets as sites of vulnerability and surveillance. Even in our language, filthy rich, dirty politics, clean record. We reveal Rome's grip on how we think about purity, privacy, and power. The Romans understood that bodies are messy, but they also believed those bodies could be managed, contained, and sanctified through routine. Not cured, just ritualized. Today, we flush toilets without thinking. We spray disinfectant on every surface. We track bowel health with apps. And still, we recoil from the idea that ancient people shared a sponge. But are we really that different? We outsource our waste to hidden pipes, anonymous workers, and invisible systems. We pretend it doesn't exist. But somewhere beneath every city, the modern Cloaca Maxima still flows, quietly, powerfully, without thanks. And if it stopped, we'd know, instantly. Rome's greatness wasn't just in its armies or architecture. It was in its ability to ritualize the unmentionable, to build infrastructure beneath the forum, and to assign gods to the gutters. They knew that even empires need to go somewhere, and they made sure the path was paved with stone ritual and a sponge on a stick. If a civilization's greatness lies beneath its streets, then what happens when we forget to look down? They say an army marches on its stomach. In ancient Rome, this was more than a proverb. It was a military doctrine. The legions of Rome, disciplined, relentless, and vast, didn't just win battles through steel and tactics. They won because someone, somewhere, made sure every soldier had bread in his hand, salt in his pouch, and vinegar in his water. In this section, we begin our exploration of how the Roman Empire fed its armies, not in battle, but on the road, in camp, and in garrison towns. From daily rations to grain requisitions, we'll discover how Rome's true genius wasn't just in its ability to kill, but in its ability to cook. Because behind every Roman victory was a very well-fed man in sandals. By the 1st century CE, the Roman military was a logistical behemoth. 28 legions, each with 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers. Thousands of auxiliaries, engineers, camp followers, and slaves. Permanent forts on the Rhine, Danube, and in the deserts of Syria. Mobile armies deployed across multiple continents. Every day, each soldier required roughly 3,000 to 4,000 calories, 2 to 3 liters of water or vinegar-diluted drink, access to fuel for cooking, tools for grinding grain and baking bread. Multiply that by tens of thousands, and now imagine doing it while marching through foreign territory. The Roman military wasn't just an army. It was a roving supply chain. Despite popular images of roast boar and overflowing goblets, Roman soldiers ate simple, sturdy, portable food. The typical diet included wheat or barley, issued as whole grain, not flour. Pulse, a grain-based porridge, sometimes flavored with garlic or vinegar. Panis militaris, hard, durable bread often baked in camp ovens. Lard, cheese, olives. Dried legumes, lentils, chickpeas, and beans. Sour wine, pasca. Vinegar diluted with water, antiseptic and refreshing. Occasional meat, often from hunting or local purchase. Soldiers carried a ration pack called a sarcina, which might include hard biscuits, buxolatum, dried meat, salt pork, and a personal grinding stone for preparing their own flour. There were no mess halls. Soldiers cooked in small groups contubernia of 8 men who shared a tent and cooked together over small fires. Roman military camps were designed like small cities, with streets, vai, defensive walls, vallum, officer quarters, latrines and bathhouses, bakehouses and granaries. In large fortresses like Vindolanda or Kulien, archaeologists have found stone ovens built into the camp perimeter, storage pits for grain, charred bread loaves carbonized by fire or abandonment, receipts and inventories listing amounts of flour issued. Each legionary fortress had its own supply officers, foragers, and mule trains dedicated to carrying grain and grinding stones. Rome had figured out what many empires failed to understand. No food equals no war. A Roman legion traveled with a mobile supply system called the impedimenta, a train of wagons, mules, and slaves carrying grain, cooking tools, spare sandals and cloaks, fuel, charcoal or dried dung, sometimes even portable millstones. Each soldier was expected to carry part of the burden, around 30 to 40 kilograms, including food for a few days, weapons, cookware, and armor. On campaign, supply lines stretched back to friendly towns or fortified granaries, horia, brick buildings designed to store grain long-term, with ventilation systems and elevated floors to reduce rot. Rome had built an empire of military food logistics, from the wheat fields of Africa to the muddy forests of Germania. The Latin word for salary, salarium, comes from salt. Why? Because salt was essential to survival. It preserved meat, flavored porridge, and maintained electrolyte balance. Some historians believe early soldiers may have received part of their pay in salt allowances, or at least currency meant to buy salt. Salt was so vital that Roman roads were built to facilitate its transport. Coastal towns developed salt pans as state-controlled enterprises. Salt mines became strategic assets. Soldiers sometimes served guard duty near salt stores. Food wasn't just fuel. It was currency. Despite stereotypes, meat was not a daily staple for Roman soldiers. Livestock was expensive to transport and easy to spoil. Soldiers sometimes received pork or beef during festivals, paydays, or when slaughtering old pack animals. More often, meat came from hunting, boar, deer, hare, and birds, local trade or pillaging, fish when near rivers or coasts. Meat was usually boiled or stewed with lentils or barley, not roasted on spits like in the movies, and every part was used. Feet, snouts, ears, nothing wasted. Feasts, when they occurred, were often symbolic. They reminded soldiers of the life they left behind, or the bounty of Rome they fought to expand. But for most of the year, it was pulse and vinegar. Feeding the legions wasn't just logistical, it was psychological. Routine meals, structured meal times, and shared cooking kept discipline high and dissent low. Even in foreign lands, eating familiar food maintained a sense of Roman identity. Food was also used as punishment. Soldiers might receive reduced rations. Reward, bonus meat or wine after victories. Symbol, bread handed out by generals to boost morale. Survival training. Legionaries were taught to forage, cook, and adapt. An army that knows how to grind its own flour is an army that can survive being cut off. And Roman soldiers often were. Their stomachs, more than their swords, kept the empire upright. If you can feed an empire, do you really need to conquer it? By now, it's clear that feeding a Roman army was a logistical miracle. But how did they do it when the legions marched deep into Gaul, crossed into Britannia, or wintered on the frozen Danube? Food doesn't transport itself. This section explores the back-end operations of Roman military logistics, the unseen world of granaries, supply officers' contracts, and 1,000 small acts of preservation and planning that made Roman conquest possible. This wasn't glamorous work. It was boring, bureaucratic, and absolutely essential. The backbone of Rome's military food system was a horium, plural, horia. These were state-operated storage facilities, built to hold grain, pulses, and dried goods for years. Supply garrisons and legions. Weather sieges and harsh winters. Buffer against famine or delay. Key features of a horium included Raised floors supported by stone piers to prevent damp. Ventilated walls using clay tiles or window slits. Tile or slate roofing to keep out rain. Sealed clay jars, dolia, buried partially underground to preserve grain and oil. Horea existed across the empire, from Ostia and Rome to Britannia, Syria, and Egypt. They were usually managed by military logisticians from Interii, grain officers, and a network of clerks, porters, and guards. One mistake could spoil tons of grain. So, as with so much else in Rome, they wrote everything down. From Vindolanda, in Roman Britain, we have actual writing tablets from the 1st and 2nd century CE, detailing grain allotments, supply requests from centurions, shipment inventories, quantities of flour used by units. For example, 10 modii wheat issued to Contubernium 4, coerci for 8 days, 30 loaves distributed to workers rebuilding the West Wall. These aren't epic tales. They're grocery lists, but they show how deeply Rome relied on standardization, record-keeping, and bureaucracy to keep its soldiers full and thus loyal. For long-distance food movement, Rome relied on sea lanes and rivers. North Africa and Egypt were key bread baskets, with wheat harvested and shipped to Italy, Greece, Gaul, legions along the Rhine and Danube. Ships loaded with grain, naves honoraria, sailed to ports like Ostia, where grain was offloaded and moved up the Tiber River or overland. Key tools of the supply system included dolium ships, vessels filled with giant ceramic jars of wine, oil, or grain, flat-bottomed barges for river transport, pack animals and ox carts for inland distribution. The state often contracted private shipping companies, providing tax exemptions in return for stable grain delivery, especially during winter, when sailing was dangerous. Food logistics were a government responsibility, not just a military one. Without refrigeration, Roman military food storage relied on salting. Meats, fish, and even cheeses were packed in salt to prevent rot. Drying. Legumes and fruits like figs and dates were dried in the sun. Smoking. Some meats were smoked, though this was less common. Pickling. Vegetables could be preserved in brine or vinegar. Fermentation. Sauces like garum and preserved wine byproducts were common. Hard baking. Biscuits like buxolatum could last for months. Soldiers were trained to spot spoilage, to rotate rations, and to build makeshift storage pits lined with straw or ash in case of emergency. Again, not glorious work. But when your next meal depends on yesterday's vinegar, you get serious about storage. In each contubernium, the 8-man group sharing a tent. Cooking rotated or was assigned. Often, one soldier would act as cook while the others foraged, cleaned gear, or dug trenches. Each squad had a pot or pan, bronze, iron, or ceramic, a grinding stone for grain, a knife, spoon, and ladle, access to a fire pit or shared oven. Recipes were improvised from millet, barley, lentils, oil, garlic, vinegar, and herbs. Bread was baked in ash or flat stones. Porridge was a universal fallback. A good camp cook meant higher morale. A bad one, diarrhea, desertion, or worse. Rome's supply system worked best in secure territory. On hostile campaigns, however, the legions relied heavily on foraging, collecting wild foods, requisitioning from locals, often forcibly, pillaging enemy towns, slaughtering livestock along the march. This was built into military strategy. Armies were expected to live off the land whenever possible. Scouting parties were often foragers, not just lookouts. Caesar's commentaries mention daily grain counts and requisitions from Gallic tribes. This practice blurred the line between supply logistics and conquest economics. Feeding the legion often meant starving the locals. When rations failed, due to weather, sabotage, or miscalculation, disaster followed. Mutiny. Soldiers refused to march or fight. Disease. Spoiled food led to dysentery or worse. Cannibalism, rare, but reported in desperate sieges. Retreat or surrender. Armies without food don't last long. At Carrhae, 53 BCE, Crassus's legion starved in the desert. At Teutoburg Forest, 9 CE, Varus's troops were isolated and cut off. At Masada, 73 CE, Roman besiegers built vast siege ramps, but still relied on daily food trains. Even when victorious, Rome never stopped feeding its fighters. If your empire's success depends not on swords, but on spoons, what happens when the spoons run dry? Rome was not built in a day, but it may have been sustained by a loaf of bread. In this final section, we examine how feeding the Roman legions became more than a logistical necessity. It became a model for empire, an engine of expansion, and, eventually, a source of economic fragility. Because when every soldier expects bread, salt, and wine, every governor, granary, and grain tax must deliver. And when that chain breaks, the whole system starts to rot. As Rome matured, military food supply evolved from reactive scrounging into a formalized system of governance. This transformation included regular contracts with grain merchants, state-monitored shipping lanes, quartermasters praefectionii, who handled grain supply, pricing, and distribution, army-wide ration standards. Every soldier, no matter where stationed, expected the same daily bread and measure of wine. This created uniformity across a vast and diverse empire. A Roman legionary posted in Judea ate the same ration, cooked the same porridge, and drank the same vinegar as one stationed in Gaul or Britain. Food became an instrument of discipline and a symbol of belonging. To eat Roman food in a Roman camp under Roman orders was to be Roman, even for auxiliaries and provincial recruits. To keep the legions fed, Rome leaned heavily on its provinces, particularly Egypt, North Africa, Numidia, and Carthage, Sicily, Gaul. These regions were required to send regular grain quotas to the capital and to military posts across the empire. This was not a suggestion. It was policy backed by census records of farms, forced requisitions when quotas were unmet, grain ships protected by military escorts. Over time, this pressure became economic strain. In lean years, local populations starved while Rome's legions ate. When revolts occurred, one of the first acts was often to burn granaries, disrupt shipping lanes, or hijack grain depots. Rome's centralized food system was powerful, but it also created resentment and relied on imperial coercion. Roman soldiers didn't just consume food. They carried food culture into the provinces. In Gaul, Britannia, and the Rhineland, archaeologists have found Roman-style ovens in local villages, imported amphorae used for wine, oil, and garum, Latin inscriptions on granaries and storage jars, recipes adapted by local populations. These regions adopted Roman ingredients, tools, and flavors. The spread of bread ovens, in particular, is closely tied to Roman garrisons. In this way, military food became cultural food. It wasn't just about calories. It was about cultural domination. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman state faced a dilemma. The army had grown massive, over 400,000 personnel, including soldiers, support staff, and dependents. Military service came with rising benefits: food rations, land grants, retirement bonuses, and citizenship. But this came at a price. More taxes on provinces, more land dedicated to grain rather than local crops, inflation and currency debasement as Rome struggled to pay for it all. Feeding the legions began to consume the very structure meant to support it. Some historians argue that this shift, from civic engagement to military entitlement, was one of the key stress points that led to Rome's slow decline. When the empire stopped expanding, it lost access to new grain zones and fresh tax bases. But the soldiers still needed to eat. And so the empire tightened the screw on its own people. The final centuries of Rome saw grain shortages in the capital, disruptions to the Annona system, state grain supply, barbarian raids on grain-producing provinces, rising banditry along supply lines, desertion among legions due to unpaid or reduced rations. The symbolic collapse came when Rome itself, no longer the seat of real power, could not feed its own people. Bread riots broke out. The state debased the coinage further. And by the 5th century CE, many military outposts began foraging or farming for themselves, no longer dependent on imperial shipments. This shift marked a psychological rupture. The empire could no longer feed its soldiers. The soldiers could no longer trust the empire. The social contract, held together by flour and oil, crumbled. Today, you can walk the ruins of Roman Horia in Ostia, Timgad, Algeria, Curlia in Wales, Baalbek, Lebanon, Palmyra, Syria. Some still show the raised floors, the ventilation systems, and even char marks from fires or looting. They are monuments to a boring but brilliant idea. A soldier without bread is no soldier at all. It wasn't marble statues or bronze weapons that held the empire together. It was grain, salt, oil, porridge, the stuff no one writes songs about. Rome's ability to feed its army became a template for all future empires. Napoleon's military food trains, British canned rations in colonial Africa, U.S. MREs during World War II, Soviet grain quotas, all echo Rome's realization that logistics wins wars. But Rome also teaches us what happens when the system eats itself, when food is no longer a reward but an entitlement, when calories become currency, when soldiers demand more than the land can give, and when the last shipment doesn't arrive. If every empire is built on bread, what happens when the flour runs out but the hunger remains? If you wander into a Roman villa in the 1st century CE, you might smell something unexpected wafting from the kitchen: boiled ostrich, flamingo and date sauce, or even stuffed dormice rolled in poppy seeds. But don't expect simple stews or rustic comfort food. These were the recipes of Apicius, the man, and later the name, behind the most infamous cookbook of the ancient world, the Re Coquinaria. This section opens a scroll on how a single name came to define the heights and stomach-churning depths of Roman gastronomy, and why the dishes he promoted were as cursed as they were celebrated. Because sometimes, history's most refined meals are the hardest to swallow. The name Apicius refers to multiple figures, but the most notorious is Marcus Gavius Apicius, a Roman gourmet from the early 1st century CE. He lived during the reigns of Augustus and Tiberius, and was famed not for his writing, but for his legendary appetite and obsession with luxury food. What we know about him comes mostly from Seneca, Pliny the Elder, and Martial, who depict Apicius as a glutton who once sailed to Libya just to sample a rumored variety of shrimp, a man who spent a fortune on food, then killed himself when he thought he might have to eat like a commoner, a madman of the stomach, whose name became synonymous with culinary excess. He did not, however, write the cookbook that bears his name. The text we now call Apicius was compiled centuries later, probably in the 4th or 5th century CE, by anonymous editors who collected hundreds of elite Roman recipes under the name de Re Coquinaria. On the subject of cooking, it's less a manual, more a scroll of curated indulgence, and it's one of the oldest surviving cookbooks in the world. The Re Coquinaria is divided into 10 sections, ranging from meats to vegetables to sauces and desserts. It includes over 400 recipes, and almost none of them provide exact measurements, cooking times, oven temperatures, clear instructions for scaling. This wasn't a guide for amateur cooks. It was a status symbol, a document for those who could afford chef slaves and rare ingredients. Some notable entries: boiled flamingo with date sauce, sow's womb and fish sauce and mustard, fattened dormice stuffed with pork and pine nuts, brain sausages with honey and pepper, garum with every single thing. If you're imagining a cuisine of subtlety and restraint, you're in the wrong empire. No discussion of Roman cooking is complete without garum, the fermented fish sauce used in almost every Apicius recipe. Garum was made by layering fish guts, blood, and small anchovies in clay vats, adding salt, leaving it to rot in the sun for weeks, straining the liquid and bottling it. The result? A salty, umami-rich sauce that smelled like death at low tide, but was used like we use ketchup, soy sauce, or Worcestershire sauce today. Apicius's recipes instruct cooks to add garum to milk dishes, pastries, soups, desserts, even fruit. Modern attempts to recreate these dishes usually result in regret. Apicius doesn't shy away from exotic ingredients. Some of the creatures sacrificed to his recipes include flamingos, tongue preferred, peacocks, cranes, sea urchins, snails fed on milk, eels fattened on human flesh. According to legend, these ingredients weren't about taste. They were displays of wealth and control. A flamingo was beautiful. Killing and eating it proved you had power. Serving a stew of sea urchin and cinnamon wasn't about flavor harmony. It was a flex. As with Roman banquets in general, the food wasn't always meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to be seen, smelled, and remembered, even if it ended in vomiting. Let's define cursed in the context of Apicius. These recipes often combine sweet, salty, sour, and putrid elements in a single dish, rely heavily on ingredients that are now either endangered or ethically horrifying, include no cooking times or temperatures, making replication nearly impossible, are written for professional chefs using slave labor, were designed for shock value, not satiety. One modern translation includes this note. Almost every dish is an attempt to preserve, disguise, or overwrite natural flavor with expensive additives. That's not a cuisine. That's a crisis in taste. Apicius relies obsessively on three things: salted sauces, especially garum; honey, added to everything from meatballs to fish; vinegar, sometimes wine vinegar, sometimes sour wine, pasca. These weren't just flavorings. They were preservation methods, fighting against Rome's biggest culinary enemies: rot, parasites, and poor storage. Most elite Roman homes didn't have refrigeration. Wealthy chefs used these strong tastes to mask decay, extend shelf life, and create foods that could travel. The result? Dishes that might have impressed the nose and eyes, but confused the tongue and challenged the gut. Roman elite dining was performative. Meals were consumed reclining. Servants brought out dish after dish. Courses were designed to surprise, even to shock. Apicius's recipes weren't intended to feed the soul. They were part of a ritual of power, a way of reinforcing hierarchy. The average Roman, soldier, slave, farmer, would never taste these dishes, which is part of why they were so elaborate. If only a few could eat like this, then cooking became a language of exclusion. When food becomes spectacle and taste becomes power, what happens to hunger? In the first section, we met the mythical figure of Apicius, the gourmand whose name became synonymous with decadence, excess, and culinary vanity in ancient Rome. We sampled his obsession with exotic ingredients, his love affair with garum, and his preference for spectacle over substance. But the cursed nature of these recipes doesn't end with the ingredient list. This section dives deeper into psychology, philosophy, and economic cost of elite Roman cuisine, as seen through the lens of the Apicius tradition, because at some point food stops being food. It becomes a performance of delusion. The Roman world had a peculiar relationship with taste. To the average Roman, food was fuel: pulse, bread, legumes, maybe a little oil. But for the elite, flavor became intellectual territory. Roman writers discuss cuisine in philosophical terms. Is it moral to enjoy sweetness? Does exotic food corrupt the soul? Can pleasure be virtuous if it comes through gluttony? Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, frequently condemned gourmet eating. He mocked Apicius, calling him a man whose stomach was more dangerous than the sword. In Letter 123, he says, he lived luxuriously so long as it was possible. He planned a splendid end. He poisoned himself when he feared that he would not be able to eat. Here, food isn't nourishment. It's a moral battleground. Most Apicius recipes serve a second purpose: extending the shelf life of food. This explains the heavy use of vinegar, honey, salt, smoke, fermentation, spices. But preservation had a social meaning too. In Rome, freshness was poor. The rich didn't want to eat what was just caught. They wanted aged, prepared, and modified foods, items that showed labor, layers, and transformation. A simple peach? Barbaric. A peach soaked in wine, honey, and cumin for 5 days in a silver dish, then repoached and presented with a saffron glaze? Civilization. Preservation became performance. The longer something lasted, the more it was worth, even if it didn't taste better, even if it was rotting inside. One of the most cursed realities of Apicius's cuisine is its cost. These recipes required imported spices, pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, from India and Arabia, fresh seafood delivered inland within hours, slaves to grind, chop, clean, and prepare, fuel for ovens, boiling pots, and roast pits, specialized tools like straining cloths, conical sieves, and baking molds. To cook like Apicius wasn't just expensive. It required an economic engine of exploitation. While Rome's elite dined on peacock eggs and truffle-stuffed livers, the labor force behind the meal worked in brutal conditions, catching, salting, fermenting, and transporting food across thousands of miles. The dishes themselves weren't cursed, but the supply chain was. Let's look at an actual Apicius recipe, translated directly. To make Isicia aumentata, Roman meatballs, mix finely ground meat with bread soaked in wine, pepper, lovage, garum, and pine nuts. Shape into small cakes, wrap in caul fat, and cook in a pan with broth and wine. Now pause. There are no proportions, no cooking time, no heat level, no guidance on broth type, no clue how to serve it. This was intentional. The Apicius text wasn't a guide for masses. It was a memory aid for skilled cooks, people who had been trained through apprenticeship, not literacy. Most elite Roman households enslaved Greek chefs or highly trained culinarii who didn't need measurements. Modern chefs attempting to recreate Apicius must guess at everything. The result? Dishes that are too salty, too sweet, or utterly inedible. But they still follow the recipe. Because cursed or not, it's authentic. Ancient authors noted that food like Apicius's wasn't just eaten in life. It was prepared in death. Rich citizens were buried with food offerings. Shrines to ancestors included bread, wine, and honey pastries. Some tombs show detailed depictions of meals, eternal feasts in stone. Sacrificial meals use similar recipes. Wine-soaked meats, barley cakes, entrails seasoned with garum. These were not nourishing foods. They were symbolic dishes, meant to show wealth, please gods, or maintain social order even after death. Apicius, therefore, lives at the crossroads of the sacred and profane, where culinary expression meets death ritual. And sometimes, the food wasn't meant to feed the living at all. One haunting thing about the recoquinaria is its redundancy. Many recipes repeat the same instructions. Add garum, add honey, add vinegar, use pepper, use fish sauce again. This repetition has a ritualistic quality, like an incantation. The cookbook becomes a culinary liturgy, endlessly repeating combinations not to innovate, but to enforce a canon. Taste becomes doctrine. The dish becomes a symbol of control, not flavor. And if it tastes awful, that's beside the point. Let's return to the man himself. Apicius, according to legend, spent over 100 million sesterces on food. When he discovered he only had 10 million left, he believed he could no longer eat properly, and took his own life with poison. Whether true or not, the story is revealing. Apicius defined himself entirely by consumption. When that was threatened, even imagined scarcity was enough to end it all. His death is perhaps the ultimate curse recipe. Take one man, add infinite wealth, season with obsession, simmer in anxiety, serve with delusion. When a recipe no longer feeds the body, but only the ego, what kind of hunger is it really satisfying? We've smelled the garum. We've diced the dormouse. We've watched as Apicius's recipes transform food into performance, excess into virtue, and kitchens into temples of vanity. Now, in this final section, we step back to ask, what did this all mean? Because the recoquinaria isn't just a record of strange meals. It's a reflection of society obsessed with appearance, disinterested in sustenance, and unaware of how precariously it perched on the edge of collapse. This was food at the end of an empire, and it left a very strange aftertaste. Despite containing hundreds of recipes, the recoquinaria was not a cookbook for ordinary Romans. Let's remember what most people ate. Grain-based porridge, pulse. Hard bread, panis. Legumes and onions. Cheese if lucky, meat if wealthier, fish if near the sea. The Apicius cookbook, by contrast, was only useful if you had a trained chef or enslaved cook, access to imported spices from Asia or Africa, enough wealth to afford regular meat, seafood, and specialized cookware, the leisure to eat in multiple courses, reclining for hours. In short, the recoquinaria was a text of the 1%, written by and for palates numb to everything except novelty. It wasn't about nourishment. It was about performance dominance and decadence. Let's return to the ingredients. Apicius uses the same core flavorings again and again. Garum, fermented fish sauce. Honey, vinegar, pepper, asafoetida, a sulfurous bitter herb. Lovage, silphium, a now extinct seasoning. Together, these created a pungent, sweet, sour, salty profile that defined elite Roman cuisine. But used in excess, without balance or subtlety, these ingredients didn't enhance food. They buried it. A roasted pig was no longer a pig. It was a sponge for syrup and fish paste. A melon wasn't a dessert. It was a vehicle for black pepper and cumin. A shrimp wasn't from the sea. It was smothered in honey, then stewed in wine. This was food disconnected from its origin, its ingredients, its identity. Taste became a kind of noise, loud, constant, numbing. Apicius represents a moment in Roman history when the empire was growing more urban, less agrarian, consuming more imports, fewer local staples, feeding more elites, but ignoring the poor, expanding in size, but hollowing out in substance. His recipes are what happen when a society loses its connection to the land. Flamingos don't nest in Roman farms. Pepper doesn't grow in Italy. Garum comes from fish guts shipped hundreds of miles. Every dish was a reminder that Rome consumed more than produced, and that eventually the bill would come due. Apicius died before the worst of it, but his food became a metaphor for how Rome digested the world and itself. By the 6th century CE, Apicius's world was gone. The Western Empire had collapsed. The grain ships stopped sailing. The elaborate villas crumbled. Garum factories shut down. Silphium went extinct. Flamingos remained uneaten. So what happened to his recipes? They survived, copied by monks, referenced by medieval scholars, and resurrected by Renaissance cooks who saw in Apicius the ghost of grandeur they could only imagine. But something had changed. In medieval Europe, lavishness was viewed with suspicion. Christian ascetics rejected rich food as sinful. Gluttony became one of the 7 deadly sins. Kitchens became humble again. Butter replaced garum. Bread replaced tongue. And Apicius? He became a cautionary tale. Despite being centuries old, Apicius's text influenced generations of culinary thinking. Renaissance chefs reference him when creating banquets for nobles. Early French cookbooks adapted his sauces into court cuisine. Modern food historians view him as the origin point of recipe writing in Europe. But most people today don't know his name. They just know the legacy. The idea that food is status. That more is better. That complexity is class. That taste equals wealth. These ideas didn't die with Apicius. They were packaged, preserved, and passed down. It wasn't the flamingos or the spice-honeyed fish. It was the idea that taste is something you conquer, not something you cultivate. Apicius didn't build a cuisine. He built a warning. His recipes, layered with arrogance and ignorance, are preserved not because they're useful, but because they reveal the precise moment when pleasure overtook purpose and food lost its connection to hunger. Here's how the final page of the Re Coquinaria ends. For boiled ostrich, pepper, mint, cumin, leeks, dates, honey, vinegar, raisin wine, broth, and oil. Pour over the bird. Serve. It reads like poetry. It also reads like a dare. If what we eat tells us who we are, then Apicius's food tells us Rome was bloated, performative, and out of balance. The empire still conquered lands, but its kitchens conquered nothing. They merely covered everything in sauce. When food forgets how to feed and chefs forget why we cook, what's really left on the plate? Imagine standing in the atrium of a grand Roman villa. The marble floor is cool. The air smells of honey, vinegar, and roasting meats. From the triclinium, you hear laughter, gentle, controlled, aristocratic. Silverware clinks. A poet recites a new verse. The host raises a goblet in a toast. And you? You are not a guest. You are a slave. Your name may never be written down. Your hands prepare the food, serve the dishes, pour the wine, clean the vomit, and light the lamps. You will not eat the flamingo. You will not sit at the table. You will not be remembered. But without you, the empire doesn't function. Without you, the banquet doesn't happen. In this section, we begin tracing the role of slavery in Roman domestic life, focusing on a labor that powered Rome's obsession with dining, luxury, and appearances. Because behind every imperial indulgence was a silent figure, trained, invisible, and utterly replaceable. Roman slaves came from everywhere. Captured in war, Gaul, Britannia, Germania, Judea, North Africa. Purchased in markets from birth. Born into slavery within Roman households. Sometimes sold into bondage due to poverty, debt, or punishment in elite homes, Domestic slaves were highly specialized. You might find culinarii, kitchen slaves, cypherai, cupbearers, structories, food arrangers and table designers, carptors, meat carvers, lecticarii, litter bearers, nomenclators, name-remembering slaves, helping host Greek guests, ornatrices, hairdressers for Roman women, petasequi, child menders and attendants. Most of these individuals lived inside the household. They ate separately, slept in closets or servant quarters, and were expected to serve invisibly but perfectly. If they failed, punishment could be swift and brutal. A slave in the kitchen might spend their entire life preparing food they were never allowed to eat. Take, for instance, the preparation of a multi-course banquet. Dishes required multiple prep stages, some starting days in advance. Ingredients included rare spices, imported wines, and exotic animals. Bread had to be baked fresh, sometimes several times per day. Meats were boiled, smoked, roasted, and carved to exacting specifications. Wine was decanted and diluted according to social hierarchy. All of this was learned through apprenticeship and repetition. Culinarii were sometimes highly respected, even feared, but always enslaved. They knew their craft well enough to rival professionals, yet had no freedom to leave, publish, or profit from their knowledge. And when the meal ended, they cleaned. Slaves not only served, they were expected to perform perfect etiquette. A cupbearer had to pour without spilling a drop. A hairdresser had to style without tugging. A bath attendant had to scrub without being noticed. A server had to anticipate need before it was voiced. All had to avoid eye contact, unless told otherwise. These expectations weren't just cultural. They were enforced by violence. Roman law allowed masters to whip, brand, mutilate, or kill their slaves with near total impunity. Some aristocrats used cruelty as entertainment, mocking stutters, setting impossible tasks, or ordering public humiliations. Even in a dinner setting, slaves were beaten for a mistake in wine temperature, punished for serving the wrong dish to the wrong guest, starved if they displeased the cook or steward, branded for escaping or stealing scraps. Dinner wasn't just food. It was discipline, display, and domination. Perhaps the most psychologically complex role was that of the Cypherius, the cupbearer. These were often young, attractive boys trained to hold wine goblets for hours at a time, pour with precision and grace, remember complex orders of dilution and vintage, stand silently, yet be always visible. In literature and satire, cupbearers often symbolize youth, vulnerability, and submission. They were subjected to abuse, verbal, physical, and sexual. They were often on display as aesthetic objects, not people. They lived in fear, because the emperor, the senator, or the general drank from their hands. If the wine was wrong, or worse, if it was poisoned, the blame would fall squarely on the cupbearer. Some were executed merely on suspicion. The job came with prestige, and also with a death sentence. Elite households trained slaves from childhood. They were taught how to walk, how to fold linens, how to cut vegetables, how to speak only when spoken to, how to smile at danger, how to disappear into a room they were working in. A good house slave was expected to be invisible but omnipresent. Mistakes weren't just punished, they were used as warnings for others. Many slaves did not speak Latin as a first language, adding another layer of vulnerability. Misunderstanding an order could be fatal. And learning the social codes of elite Rome, which were never written down, was essential for survival. There were no guidebooks, no second chances, only discipline and silence. In some homes, food and wine were tested for poison by slaves. The tester would take the first bite or sip of every dish meant for the master. If the food was clean, it was served. If not, well, there was no second tester. This role was considered disposable. Some were blinded, so they couldn't see what was coming. Others were forced to live in isolation to reduce the chance of conspiracy. They were not people. They were filters. Even in death, they weren't remembered. They were just the first to taste what killed the master. If the hands that feed an empire are shackled and silenced, can we really call it civilized? In the previous section, We explore the day-to-day realities of domestic slaves, the cooks, cupbearers, and attendants who worked behind the scenes in Roman homes. They dressed the tables, polished the silver, and carried steaming platters of ostrich and spiced dormice to guests who would never know their names. But to understand how deeply slavery was embedded in Rome's food culture, we have to widen the lens. This section explores the economic, cultural, and emotional dimensions of Roman slavery, particularly as it related to dining and social display. Because in Rome, slavery wasn't just a labor system, it was a worldview. For wealthy Romans, owning slaves wasn't just convenient, it was necessary for reputation. A senator might own hundreds of slaves across estates and villas. A modest elite household in Rome might have 15 to 20, including a personal chef, a doorman, ossuarius, and a water carrier. Some of the most prestigious slaves were visible ones: the cupbearer, the food carver, the doorkeeper, the herald who announced guests. The more skilled and specialized the slave, the higher the owner's social standing. Apicius, the legendary gourmand, reportedly trained his cooks as artisans, outfitting them with copper tools and demanding silence and perfection. Their labor wasn't seen as humanity. It was an extension of his glory. Behind the slaves in the villa were thousands more on the land. Agricultural slaves grew wheat, grapes, and olives. Mill slaves ground flour day and night in rotating shifts. Garum factory slaves gutted and salted anchovies by the ton. Port slaves carried amphorae up gangplanks and onto carts. Bakery slaves operated massive public ovens in cities like Pompeii. Market slaves worked stalls, weighed produce, and arranged deals. Feeding a Roman city or an army required a nationwide slave economy. Modern historians estimate that in the late Republic and early Empire, up to 30% of Italy's population was enslaved, and many of those people worked in food. Slave auctions in Rome were highly specialized. Cooks, in particular, fetched high prices. Skilled culinarii were sold for more than architects or scribes. Sellers often exaggerated a cook's skills, can boil 5 dishes at once, knows how to handle flamingo, trained in Apician style. Branding was common, especially for escapees or rural laborers. Market stalls displayed sample dishes supposedly cooked by the slave for sale. Some of these cooks were famous within elite circles, passed from one household to another as a kind of culinary trophy. But most remained nameless and invisible, their talent consumed alongside the food. The same meals that amazed the Roman elite were also tools of control. Slaves were rarely allowed to eat what they cooked, punished for stealing scraps, restricted in meal times and locations, fed in rank-based tiers, kitchen workers below house attendants, field slaves at the bottom, forced to fast on certain festival days or as penance. Even hunger became a hierarchy. Some slaves, especially cooks, were intentionally overfed to keep them docile and slow. Others were starved as a form of humiliation, and some were given poisoned food as punishment or to end their lives quietly. In Rome, food was never just food. Few written records exist from slaves themselves, but scattered fragments survive. In graffiti from Pompeii, a cook named Severus writes, "I eat better scraps than the freedman. He dines like a senator. I serve him still." In a tomb inscription near Ostia, to Melania, once enslaved, freed by fortune, who prepared the meals of 3 masters and buried 2. A wax tablet found in Vindolanda records. 3 slaves punished for wasting flour, 1 flogged, 2 reassigned to the vineyard. These aren't full stories, but they are echoes, reminders that behind every honeyed date and fish-stuffed pheasant was a lifetime of silent labor. Some slaves fought back, not through uprisings, but through daily subversion, oversalting food, undercooking bread, serving sour wine, disrupting meal timing, breaking dishes or dulling knives, forgetting orders. In literature, this became a trope, the clever slave who uses wit and sabotage to outsmart the master. In life, it was a form of survival. Cooking, after all, was the only domain where a slave had some control, and sometimes revenge was played at cold. Not all slaves remained enslaved. Manumission, the act of freeing a slave, was common, especially for trusted domestic staff. Cooks, attendants, and personal valets were often freed in wills, granted freedom after decades of service, allowed to open small shops or taverns, adopted as clients of their former masters. But even after freedom, their identity remained tied to slavery. They became liberti, freed persons. They could own property, marry, and testify in court, but they could not forget, because the kitchen, the site of their labor, never let go. If a dish delights the powerful but destroys the person who made it, can we call it a triumph of culture or a monument to silence? The banquet is over. The guests have left. The plates are cracked. The oil lamps gutter. And still, someone is cleaning. A kitchen slave wipes down the table. Another pulls bones from the ash pit. A third, barely older than a child, collects broken amphorae to be buried or reused. No statues will be built for them. No names will survive. But the Roman Empire, its meals, its rituals, its performances of power, was impossible without them. In this final section, we reflect on the legacy of Rome's enslaved kitchen laborers, not in monuments, but in memory. Their absence from most histories is not evidence of insignificance. It's proof of how deeply Rome relied on forgetting. Unlike emperors, senators, or generals, slaves left few traces. But modern archaeology is beginning to recover their world. In Pompeii, carbonized remains of kitchen areas reveal cramped, windowless workspaces beside opulent triclinium dining rooms. At Herculaneum, a bakery preserved by Vesuvius shows hand mills worn smooth by years of labor, likely turned by animal and human slaves. In Ostia, communal slave quarters were found tucked behind elite villas, small, narrow rooms with no decoration, no privacy, and no names. In Vindolanda, a Roman fort in Britain, tablets mention the cook's boy being beaten for theft and a slave named Optatus preparing meals for officers. These are not tombs of heroes. They're the evidence of use. Tools worn to bone, kitchens scoured by ash, doorways barely wide enough for a human to pass through. They tell us what Rome built and what it erased. To the enslaved kitchen laborer, food was not nourishment. It was a burden, a weapon, a measure of control, a job done without rest or reward. And yet they were skilled. The cooks of Rome created dishes we still study. They mastered heat without thermometers, flavor without recipes, and texture without modern tools. They managed ingredients that spoiled quickly, stoves that burned unevenly, and masters who punished failure. They worked without ownership, and still they fed the empire. The recipes of Apicius, the lavish banquets of Domitian, the civilizing cuisine of elite Romans, none of it existed without them. Roman historians rarely mention slaves as individuals. They appear in stories as background, property, instruments of punishment, punchlines in satire, symbols of wealth. Even Pliny the Elder, who praised educated slaves, writes about them as assets, not as people. This silence was deliberate. To maintain the illusion of Roman supremacy, slavery had to be normalized, aestheticized, and made invisible. It was the same logic used to clean the triclinium. The floor must shine, even if someone else bleeds to scrub it. And yet, some slaves did leave traces. A funerary stele for Epagathus, a former kitchen slave, reads, "He brought warmth to the cold hands that fed Rome." An epitaph for Cytheris, a freed woman who once served wine at elite banquets, states, "Once I poured for men who ruled the world. Now I rest when no one serves." A mosaic in a Roman villa shows a young boy holding a tray. He is unnamed, but he is the only figure facing the viewer. Everyone else looks away. Even in these fragments, something profound remains. A ghost in the kitchen, a hand in the flame, a voice that almost broke the silence. Rome eventually fell, not in a single night, but in slow unravelings. The banquets grew smaller. The recipes faded. The cookbooks were forgotten. The slaves disappeared, absorbed into rural serfdom, monastic labor, or historical oblivion. But the labor model persisted. Medieval servants cooked for kings with the same thankless precision. Colonial plantations used enslaved chefs to create national cuisines. Even today, modern kitchens rely on invisible workers, often migrants, often unpaid well, often unacknowledged. Apicius's food may have died, but the hierarchy he embodied lives on. This story began with food, but it ends with silence. Because the slave who served empire, the one who ground the grain, salted the fish, and stirred the stew, never got to write their version. And yet, their hands were everywhere. In the bread, in the wine, in the fire, in the salt. They may not have sat at the table, but they held it up. If every civilization eats in silence the labor that sustains it, how long until that silence becomes hunger? In a Roman kitchen, the most valuable liquid was not wine, nor olive oil, nor perfume. It was garum, a fermented fish sauce that saturated Roman cuisine, commerce, and class. It was poured over roasted boar, mixed into fruit dishes, blended with honey and pepper, drizzled into wine. And it smelled, oh how it smelled, from Hispania to Alexandria, from the villas of senators to the pots of commoners. Garum was everywhere. But what made this stinking sauce so desirable? Why did Rome worship at the altar of decay? This section uncovers a surprisingly sophisticated industry behind garum, its uses, its status, and how Rome managed to build an empire where power came bottled in fish guts. Garum was made by fermenting. Small oily fish, especially anchovies, sardines, or mackerel. Fish blood heads guts and bones. Sea salt, lots of it. Occasionally, herbs or wine for flavor. The process. Fish and salt were layered in large clay vats. The mixture was left to rot in the sun for several weeks. Enzymes and bacteria broke down the flesh into a salty, protein-rich brine. The liquid was collected through strainers and siphons. The result? A clear amber-brown liquid that was surprisingly stable, rich in umami, and highly prized. Garum was not just a byproduct. It was a deliberately crafted regional product, with prestige versions sold in amphory marked with branding, origin, and trade seals. Garum wasn't just food. It was commerce. By the 1st century CE, entire industries revolve around fish sauce. Key production centers included Belo Claudia, Spain. Ruins still show vats and drainage channels. Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, produced the most elite garum, known as Garum Sociorum. Pompeii and Herculaneum. Local brands existed alongside imports. Southern Gaul and Dalmatian coastlines, where fishing, salting, and fermentation were seasonal labor. Garum amphorae were traded across the empire, with distinctive markings. Liquamen primum, first strain garum, elite. Alec, the gritty leftover paste for the poor. Garum Sociorum, garum of the allies, considered the finest vintage. Elite Romans might serve garum with spoons of ivory, while the poor bought the dregs in reused pottery jars. As with wine, flavor mattered, but origin mattered more. Garum was branded luxury, one that literally reeked of wealth. You can't talk about garum without talking about the smell. Garum factories, called satiri, were placed outside cities for a reason. The fermentation process produced hydrogen sulfide, rotten egg smell, ammonia, decomposing fish stench, seaweed and salt air combined with death. Pliny the Elder described the smell as intolerable, but noted that the taste was exquisite. Elite producers mitigated the odor by sealing vats under stone lids, building facilities downhill or downwind from villas, designing amphorae to limit spillage and off-gassing. Still, many towns, like Belo Claudia, were effectively garum towns, known as much for their stink as for their export wealth. Slaves and laborers in these areas lived and worked in constant stench, an odor that clung to skin, hair, and clothing. Garum was a success, but it was never elegant. Garum appeared in more Roman recipes than any other single ingredient. The cookbook of Apicius includes it in meat stews, vegetable dishes, fruit preserves, seafood sauces, pastries, wine punch, even in milk-based puddings. It was used to replace salt, mask spoiled food, add umami richness, serve as medicine for indigestion, wounds, and dog bites, create oxyporum, a kind of proto-Worcestershire vinegar mix. Even Roman soldiers received dried garum concentrate in their rations, easily transported and rehydrated. The poor added it to barley porridge. The rich poured it over truffles. It was, in every sense, the taste of Rome. Not all garum was equal. There were cheap local brews made quickly and sold to laborers and slaves. These had stronger, more bitter flavors, higher residue content, often included fish bones or scales, prone to spoilage if handled poorly. Elite garum, on the other hand, was carefully strained, stored in glazed amphorae, shipped in branded crates, price equivalent to imported wine or rare spices. In elite homes, garum was a talking point, an object of commentary, comparison, even poetry. It may have started as rotting fish, but through class and craftsmanship, it became liquid prestige.